Nick, you went in a different direction from Susan and Steve in that instead of doing the kind of conventional, more conventional, Tony Lucas's approach, so to call it conventional is minimizing a fine narrative technique, but the idea of selecting a half dozen characters, which Susan did, Steve did, Tony Lucas did, you decided you were going to do something different. You could have done that.
I thought about it, actually.
And why did you decide not to?
Well, that's how kind of, I mean, if I could stand going back to reading my original proposal, what I would find is exactly that idea to try and tell the story of the Nazi concentration camps through the history, through the stories of maybe a dozen or so individuals. And the more I worked on this, the more I realized that that wasn't going to be the way to go for me in this case, because even 12 people couldn't tell you a representative story of the camps. There isn't I mean, we all associate certain images, certain ideas, certain pictures with the concentration camps. One important thing to say is that there isn't a typical prisoner. Your experience of the camps varied enormously depending on your national background, your job, your age, when you were taken to the camps, your gender, which camp you were taken to, who with you ended up in a camp, where you end up in the prisoner hierarchy. So just going through this now, you can see that we're dealing with a huge number of different groups of prisoners and victims, and I wanted to tell their story as comprehensively as I could. There's also, of course, the point that a lot of the inmates do not survive. Those who Primo Levi called the drowned. How do I give them a voice? Mm-hmm. I couldn't interview them. So I had to find other ways to try and make their story just as much part of the narrative as the story of those where we do have post-war testimony.
I noticed that you went back to Primo Levi a number of times. Did that help your narrative? It's such a mammoth work of synthesis. It's so daunting what you accomplished and accomplished so brilliantly, really. But to keep the reader going, did you feel like you had to introduce certain humane voices?
I mean, I tried, I thought a lot about what my tone should be for this book, what the right kind of language would be to approach this. And the decision I took fairly early on was that I wanted to take myself out of the narrative, if I could, and try as much as possible to let the survivors, the prisoners, those who didn't survive, but also the perpetrators and those who looked onto the camps from outside, speak and weave their stories into the narrative. I mean, I was really surprised the more work I did, how many prisoners in the camps themselves tried to write their experiences, tried to leave glimpses of their life inside, of their loved ones, family, friends, and so on. These are secret diaries which were written. These are secret letters, notes, even photographs which were taken. And they give an incredibly immediate insight into what their camps were like at the time, what prisoners thought, felt, hoped for at the time, the rumors which go around the camps, and so on. So it's a bit like a choir of different voices, and some of them, like Primo Levi, crop up again and again, kind of others you only hear once.
There's so much in this book that I did not know, and I thought I knew a fair amount about concentration camps, and it started with how many there were. I guess 27 main camps and 1,100 satellite camps across how many countries? And could you just very briefly tell us about the differences between the camps, which were work camps, which were death camps?
How long do I have?
Again.
I mean, there's a reason the book is kind of, I don't know how long it is. It's very heavy to carry. So, best to maybe go for the paperback.
Well, I'll try to make it easier for you because that is such a broad question. So Auschwitz, for instance, you say it was the only one of the camps that was central to the final solution, and that 1.7 million Jews died in the camps. So most of those who died in the Holocaust died outside the camps, you argue, and Auschwitz is, you have in a little bit of a different category from Dachau and the other camps that you cover. Why?
It's Auschwitz is a good starting point maybe for the discussion. I mean, in recent decades, Auschwitz has become almost synonymous with the Holocaust and also with the concentration camp system. I mean, this is what most people associate with the camps and the Holocaust now. There are three things I think which are important to say here. One, there is more to the Holocaust than Auschwitz, which is a point I tried to make in the book. Auschwitz is the single most deadly place in the Nazi so-called final solution. There is no other site in German-controlled Europe where more Jews are murdered than Auschwitz. And yet, many more Jews are killed elsewhere than in Auschwitz, in ditches, in forests, and in special death camps like Treblinka, and which operate differently, separately from the concentration camp system. So that's the first thing to say. The second is that there is also more to Auschwitz than the Holocaust. Auschwitz is not set up as a camp to murder the Jews of Europe. Auschwitz is set up in 1940 to destroy the Polish opposition. And even when Auschwitz becomes also a death camp of the Holocaust, and it is the only one of those concentration camps which becomes a major death camp of the Holocaust, even then it has other functions. These concentration camps always have multiple functions. Slave labor, medical experiments, and so on. So there is more to Auschwitz than the Holocaust. And there is more to the concentration camp system than Auschwitz. By the time Auschwitz is set up in 1940, the first SS camp, Dachau, is in existence for more than 7 years. And camps like Auschwitz are influenced, shaped by those earlier camps. It is in Dachau where the first commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, learns how to abuse prisoners. He learns the ethos of the SS, which he then implements in Auschwitz. So the story is much bigger. Auschwitz is part of this wider network of camps. And I'm starting the book with 3 different scenes from Dachau, which try, I hope, to bring home to readers just how dynamic and different this system was. I said before that there wasn't a typical prisoner. There's also no typical camp. So Dachau in 1933 is a tiny improvised site, a rundown munitions factory, which they improvise, quickly set up some camp to hold some local communists. We've got 100, 120 of those men. They're treated fairly humanely. They sleep in the same building as the guards. None of them think that they're going to be there for very long. Neither do the guards. 1939, completely different scene. Several thousands of prisoners, striped uniforms. Suddenly we have this order of terror, which we associate maybe with the camps. And then 1945, we have 30,000 or so prisoners from all over Europe, no longer just German prisoners, but kind of German prisoners and a tiny minority now. And we have dead and half-dead prisoners all over the camp when the Allies arrive and the Americans arrive. So even a space like Dachau has changed completely.
And a lot of prisoners died after liberation, right? So at one point, I think you say 10% in a couple of the camps died after they were liberated. They were so weak.
My guesstimate is that up to about 30,000 survivors don't survive the first weeks or months of liberation. The book, the main chapter of the book ends with the liberation of Dachau. And there is a scene which I describe of 2 prisoners, a Jewish prisoner, a German prisoner, who embrace and they cry, and there is great elation. The Americans are here, finally they're free. And it would have been tempting after a book which is about the most unimaginable horrors to end with this kind of on an upbeat note, if you will, a kind of, Schindler's List happy end, if you will. But that would have been wrong. It would have been false. And what I then do in the epilogue is tell the story of these 2 men, and it's not a happy end. One of them, they both end up in America for a while, but they live hand to mouth. One of them kind of works as a professional Santa Claus, as a kind of doorman in a cinema, before he goes back to Europe and dies a destitute, unknown man. And his former colleague from Dachau doesn't fare much better. And these stories, post-liberation, I think, are part of the history of the camps too. So, I don't want to, it would have been tempting to end on this with this moment of liberation, which you can read about and see in, there are the pictures. There's a picture in the book of celebrating prisoners in Dachau, cheering and so on. But this kind of jubilation doesn't last. It doesn't last very long.
There are many poor Holocaust survivors in the United States. I'm involved with an organization called the Blue Card, if anybody's interested, that helps those who, and many didn't have any family here. They came like that man who played Santa Claus for a while, and they've had hard lives in the United States and need some help. But I was also really struck by how little justice there was, and that some workers in the camps, prison guards, were overpunished. Capos, who were often inmates who were put in charge of other inmates, some of them were actually executed, whereas others got away scot-free, and not just by going to Latin America. They somehow avoided justice. Say some of the I.G. Farben executives who set up these, these labor camps that might as well have been death camps, given the death toll in them.
Yes, I mean it's not just the kind of businessmen and so on. I mean, it is also the rank and file guards. Most of them get away. I mean, Polish colleagues have tried to follow the paths of former Auschwitz guards, and I think 6,000 or 6,500 or so survived the Second World War, and maybe 15% of them end up in court. So you can do the maths. The great majority don't. In the early post-war period, in the early months and years, there are a large number of trials. They are very haphazard, but there are trials. And most of the bigwigs of the camp system are tried. But most of the rank and file get away, and by the time you get to the late 40s, early 50s, we've got the Cold War. It's no longer politic to really talk about the past. Everybody wants to move on in East and West. And both in East Germany and West Germany, these trials really fall by the wayside.